Your soul will recognize itself in this video because what hurts in you is not exhaustion, not confusion, not a lack of direction. It is a lost spiritual identity, the memory of the soul suffocated inside a body that forgot who it truly is. You live with the feeling of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, trapped in a life far too small for what you feel inside. And this is not imagination, it is the clash between who you were before reincarnation and the character you were forced to wear here. The real problem was never finding a purpose. That is the language of the ego. The problem is that you forgot the origin of your soul, forgot the spiritual destiny that brought you into this incarnation, and the ego fills that void with fear, routine, and distraction. In true Hermeticism, faithful to the corpus hermeticum, Thoth, understood as Hermes Trismegistus, the intelligence that transmits Gnosis, never spoke of external salvation but of inner recognition. Awakening happens when like recognizes like, and that is why this video reached you. Nothing was coincidence. Your ego will resist this sentence, but listen with the soul. What you feel is not a desire to learn something new. It is memory trying to emerge. You do not want information. You want the final awakening, the return to the soul's true I, the one that existed before birth, before the name, before personal history. In Gnosticism, this is called anamnesis, remembering what the soul knew before being cast into forgetfulness, before falling into the ignorance of matter. In Hermeticism, this is the movement of return of the Nous to its origin, when consciousness ceases to identify with the body, with time and with the ego, and begins to recognize its hidden spiritual identity. Thoth does not teach who you must become. He points to who you have always been. And this is disturbing because it destroys the most comfortable belief you carry, the idea that your divine mission will still be built. No, the mission will not be created, it will be remembered. Your soul is not common, not because it is special in the egoic sense, but because it is ready. Chosen soul in the Gnostic sense, mature enough to recognize the call. That is why you feel hunger for transcendence, spiritual trauma without an apparent cause, the sense of being different since always. The truth that only the awakened will understand is simple and brutal. You are not here to adapt, you are here to remember. Incarnation did not erase your essence, it only covered it. And when that memory begins to vibrate, when the soul's origin starts to become conscious, something breaks inside. And the question that remains open, hammering, impossible to silence, is whether you are prepared to remember everything your soul knows up to, and what that will require you to abandon now. You feel this when the world goes silent for a second and something in you observes everything from the outside, not as escape, but as remembrance. This sensation is not dissociation, it is recognition. In Hermeticism, this is the Nous awakening within the incarnated soul. The spark that knows this world is not the origin. The ego calls this strangeness because it lives from identification with time, fear, and personal history. The soul calls it return. You are not broken. You are remembering. And remembering hurts because it dismantles everything that was built to keep you functioning without questioning. The suffering that accompanies you does not come from common traumas. It comes from the friction between the hidden spiritual identity and the mask you learn to sustain in order to survive here. This is not spiritual drama, it is raw gnosis. In the corpus hermeticum, ignorance is described as the greatest evil, not in a moral sense, but as forgetfulness of self. When the soul forgets its origin, it confuses itself with the body, with the name, with the social role. And when it begins to remember, everything that is false starts to creak from within. That is why you never truly felt that you belonged. You have already noticed that nothing external fills the void. Not achievements, not relationships, not accumulated knowledge, because the emptiness you feel is not the absence of something outside, it is the absence of inner recognition. The soul's true self does not feed on stimuli, it feeds on truth. Gnosticism calls this world a place of forgetfulness, not as condemnation, but as diagnosis. The soul enters here and forgets in order to experience, but there comes a point when experience is exhausted and remembrance begins to press. This is the final awakening, when living without knowing who you are becomes unbearable. You feel that your life could have been different because, on a deep level, it already was. Not in the literal sense of personal memories, but in the ontological sense. Your soul knows states of existence where there was no fear, no urgency, no fragmentation. This is not fantasy, it is archetypal memory. Hermes Trismegistus does not speak of escaping the world, but of not being governed by it. He points out that the awakened human being recognizes the difference between what is used and what is. The body is used, the mind is used, the ego is a tool, but none of them is you. The shock comes when you realize you spent years trying to improve the wrong character. The ego wants evolution, the soul wants remembrance. The ego wants the future, the soul wants origin. And this difference changes everything. You always felt there was something more waiting to be activated, not as power, but as clarity. The hidden divine mission is not to do something grand in the eyes of the world, it is to sustain lucidity in the midst of forgetfulness. This requires more courage than any external conquest. When Thoth speaks of liberating knowledge, he does not refer to accumulated information, but to recognition of the immortal principle within the human. This recognition reorganizes all perception. Fear loses authority, hurry loses meaning, comparison dies, you are not late. Time is a construction of the plane in which you are operating now. The soul is not measured by chronology but by maturity. And spiritual maturity is the capacity to endure truth without adornment. That is why this video does not teach techniques. Techniques feed the illusion that something must be achieved. Here the movement is inverse. Removing layers, dismantling internal lies, allowing remembrance to emerge without resistance. Lost spiritual identity is not recovered through effort, but through lucid surrender. When you stop trying to define yourself, the true definition appears on its own. This frightens the ego because it makes it unnecessary. You feel the call because your soul is already ready. Ready does not mean perfect, it means tired of pretending, tired of repeating cycles that lead nowhere, tired of living as if this were the only level of reality. The forbidden truth is not secret because someone hid it. It is forbidden because it dissolves too many internal structures for those who still need them. Not everyone wants to remember. You do, and that has consequences. The soul's remembrance before birth does not come in clear images. It comes as silent certainty, a certainty that you did not begin here and you do not end here. And that certainty changes how you walk, speak, choose, and remain. Awakening is not euphoria, it is radical sobriety. It is looking at the world and not allowing yourself to be hypnotized. It is living here without belonging here. It is fulfilling the spiritual destiny without needing to explain it to anyone. You begin to realize that many pains you carried were not yours, they were symptoms of collective forgetfulness. When the soul awakens, it stops assuming guilt that was never its own. And the more you recognize this, the more something opens within, like an ancient door slowly creaking open, revealing questions you always avoided asking. Questions that do not ask for quick answers, but real presence. And the main one begins to take shape now, pressing against your consciousness, demanding absolute honesty. This question that begins to form within you does not come from the mind, it comes from a more ancient place. It is the same question that has accompanied the soul since before incarnation. Why am I here now? It is not curiosity. It is memory pressing against consciousness. The ego tries to turn this into anxiety, but the soul recognizes it as a calling. You have always felt that there was something wrong with normality. People accept routines, repetitions, entire lives without questioning, and this has always caused you a deep discomfort. This is not spiritual arrogance. It is an ontological incompatibility between the soul's identity and the theater of the world. When remembrance begins, everything becomes more sensitive. Sounds, silences, glances, small decisions. Because the awakened soul does not live on autopilot. It perceives the weight of each choice not as guilt, but as alignment or distance from what is real. You are not becoming confused. Confused are those who never question. What happens to you is misalignment. The social character starts to feel too tight for the consciousness growing within, and nothing is more uncomfortable for the ego than realizing it is not the center. In Hermeticism, the greatest prison is not external. It is identification with what changes. The body changes, emotions change, roles change, the soul does not. When you touch this, even for a second, something stabilizes within you, as if there were finally ground beneath your feet. That is why you seek deep revelations and reject superficiality. Your soul no longer accepts ready-made answers, it wants naked truth, it wants origin, it wants to remember who it was before fear, before fragmentation, before the need to prove itself. Final awakening does not happen as an explosion, it happens as a silent rupture. One day you simply can no longer lie to yourself, you can no longer live as if you did not know. And this changes everything, even if nothing external changes immediately. You begin to realize that many relationships were sustained only by the character. When the character weakens, those connections also weaken. This hurts, but it is liberating. The soul does not negotiate its truth to preserve comfort. The hidden divine mission is not written in words. It reveals itself as inner coherence. When you act aligned with remembrance, there is peace even in chaos. When you act against it, there is discomfort even in success. Gnosticism has always pointed out that the problem is not that the world exists, but that we forget who is observing the world. When you remember, the world loses the power to define you. It continues to exist, but it no longer dominates you. You feel that something in you observes your thoughts. This awareness does not think, does not react, does not panic, it simply sees. This is not a learned technique. It is the soul's true self emerging behind the noise. The ego tries to appropriate this experience and create a new spiritual identity. But the soul does not want a new label. It wants enough silence to recognize itself without interference. The soul's remembrance before birth is not nostalgia, it is pattern recognition. You recognize truths when you hear them because they were already within you. That is why certain words pass straight through without effort. You begin to understand that you are not here to save anyone, convince anyone, or prove anything. Your lucid presence is already the work. Your clarity is already the message. Your integrity is already the breaking of the cycle. When Thoth speaks of the ascent of the human to the divine, he is not speaking of escaping matter, but of consciousness governing experience. The awakened one does not reject the world. He moves through it without losing himself in it. This feeling of being an ancient soul is not vanity. It is spiritual maturity, the sense of having lived enough to no longer be deceived by empty promises. You seek essence because you are tired of surface. The fear that arises as you approach this truth is not a sign of error. It is the ego realizing it will not survive intact through complete remembrance. And it is right to fear. You realize that you were never truly lost, only asleep. And there is an immense difference between losing the path and forgetting who walks it. Now, something in you begins to awaken for real. The more this remembrance grows, the more impossible it becomes to go back. Not because someone prevents you, but because you can no longer unsee. The hidden spiritual identity begins to take up too much space to be ignored. And it is exactly at this point when the old self no longer holds and the true self has not yet fully revealed itself, that tension increases, silence grows denser, and a new question begins to form within you. Deeper, more dangerous, more definitive, ready to open another level of remembrance if you dare to face it. This new question does not ask for an immediate answer because it does not belong to time. It passes through you as a silent recognition. What in me was never born? This question does not come from the rational mind. It comes from the soul's memory beginning to loosen itself from the bonds of forgetfulness. You begin to notice that most human suffering is born from the attempt to become something, when the soul only wants to remember what it already is. The constant effort to define yourself, explain yourself, position yourself, is the symptom of a lost spiritual identity trying to sustain itself through the ego. Nothing in you is accidental. Not this restlessness, not this sense of not fitting, not this exhaustion from repeating patterns. All of it is a sign that the soul's origin is beginning to press against the surface of consciousness. When remembrance approaches, the world seems artificial. Conversations sound empty. Ambitions seem small, not because you are superior, but because your soul no longer feeds on the same level of illusion. Hermeticism points out that the human being sleeps within himself. It is not physical sleep, it is a sleep of identity. To awaken is not to gain something, but to lose what was never you. You feel fear because remembrance demands loss of characters, of stories, of justifications. The ego calls this a threat. The soul calls it return. There comes a point when you realize that you were never searching for anything outside. Everything you sought in books, messages, videos, and symbols was only a mirror trying to provoke inner recognition. Gnosticism calls this liberation from forgetfulness. It is not external rebellion, it is internal rupture. The prison was always in identification, never in circumstances. You begin to realize that your entire life has been a silent preparation, the pains, the distances, the nameless crises. Nothing was wasted. Everything was the refinement of the capacity to remember without going mad. The ready soul does not awaken in ecstasy, it awakens in sobriety. It does not shout, it positions itself. It does not seek applause, it sustains presence. You feel that there is something observing behind your thoughts, but now this presence begins to move closer to the center of your life, not as theory, but as axis. The ego tries to turn this into a new spiritual identity, a new role, a new narrative, but the closer you get to the truth, the less need you feel to name yourself. Remembrance does not pull you away from life, it returns you to real life, without filters. You remain here, but now aware of why. You begin to notice that many choices that once felt confusing now start to align on their own, not because you decided better, but because something deeper has taken the lead. The soul's true self does not debate, does not negotiate, does not justify itself. It simply is. And this completely disarms inner chaos. The feeling of being watched by the world begins to fade. When you remember who you are, you no longer need validation. Presence is enough. You begin to understand that final awakening is not a future event. It happens in layers. Each remembrance dissolves an old illusion. The hidden divine mission does not push you out of the world. It places you fully within it, without fragmentation. You act, but you do not lose yourself in action. The more you sustain this remembrance, the more inner noise loses its power. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer rule. You begin to realize that you were never alone. The loneliness came from mistaken identification. A recognized soul is never isolated. And now, as this presence stabilizes, an even deeper question begins to pulse. Not as doubt, but as a threshold. A question that cannot be ignored because touching it means crossing a point of no return. And what it asks for is not ordinary courage, but absolute honesty about who you are truly willing to let die so that remembrance may continue. That absolute honesty begins when you realize that the greatest attachment is not to people, things, or stories. It is to the character you believed yourself to be. That character was born from the need to survive in forgetfulness, but now it becomes the final obstacle between you and complete remembrance. You feel resistance because the ego was trained to control, explain, and protect. The soul needs none of that, it simply recognizes. And this recognition dismantles the entire architecture that once sustained fear. The more you allow this silent presence to take over, the clearer the difference becomes between living by reaction and living by remembrance. Reaction is automatic, remembrance is conscious, one binds, the other liberates. You begin to see that many past decisions were not mistakes, they were attempts by the soul to express itself through a system that could not understand it. This gives rise to compassion for yourself, not guilt. The sense of divine mission does not arise as a heavy task, but as inevitable alignment. When you remember who you are, certain choices stop being options, they simply happen. The world does not change. What changes is the place from which you perceive it. And this inner shift is irreversible. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. You begin to notice that silence becomes more fertile than any explanation. In it, the soul organizes itself without interference. It is in this space that deeper memory emerges. The ego tries to create urgency. Do something with this. The soul responds with presence. Remain with this. And this difference defines the true rhythm of awakening. You realize that you do not need to convince anyone of what you are living. Truth requires no witnesses. It stands on its own. The hidden spiritual identity does not ask for a stage. It asks for coherence. It reveals itself in how you walk, speak, choose, and withdraw when necessary. The fear of going mad arises because the mind fears losing control. But remembrance does not disorganize, it reorganizes. The chaos was already there, it simply went unnoticed. You begin to feel that there is a deeper intelligence guiding your movements, not as an external voice, but as inner clarity. The questions that once tormented you now turn into gateways. You do not want quick answers. You want to remain in truth as it reveals itself. The feeling of being an ancient soul deepens, not as nostalgia, but as responsibility. To remember is to live with greater integrity. There is no pretending after this. You notice that many distractions lose their flavor. Not out of moralism, but because they can no longer anesthetize what has awakened. The soul's origin ceases to be a concept and becomes an inner reference. You begin to orient yourself by it, even when you do not understand everything. Final awakening does not isolate you from the world. It returns you to the world without emotional dependence. You participate, but you do not confuse yourself with it. You begin to notice that your presence affects the environment, not through mystical energy, but through coherence. Truth stabilizes the field around it. The hidden divine mission begins to reveal itself not as a great future act, but as daily fidelity to remembrance, small, constant, non-negotiable. You realize that the greatest service you can offer is not to fall asleep again. To sustain remembrance is rarer than any talent. And as this lucidity deepens, another layer begins to open, bringing yet another silent question, even more intimate, even more demanding. A question that does not ask for an answer in words, but for a living choice, made now, in how you decide to exist from here on. And this choice continues to form, calling you to remain attentive, because the next movement of remembrance will not be gentle. You begin to realize that the greatest deception was not the world, it was the idea that you needed to adapt to it in order to exist. That adaptation came at a high cost. It cost the soul's memory, it cost clarity about why you are here, it cost contact with the true self that watches in silence while the ego struggles. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from the body, an ancient deep exhaustion that no night of sleep can resolve. This exhaustion comes from the soul pretending to be something it is not. It is the wear of sustaining an identity that was never true. You feel that there is something within you that was never touched by the world, not by trauma, not by loss, not by attempts to shape you, that something remained intact, observing everything, waiting for the right moment to be recognized. As this remembrance approaches, everyday life begins to feel like a repeated theater. The same lines, the same ambitions, the same recycled fears, and you sense that you can no longer perform with conviction. This is not contempt for people. It is estrangement. You see how everyone is trying to be someone while you begin to suspect that the true movement is to stop being the character. The soul does not shout. It presses with silence. It presses with discomfort. It presses with questions that do not quiet down. It presses until ignoring becomes more painful than remembering. You begin to notice that your sensitivity is not weakness, it is radar, it is the ability to perceive subtle misalignments. The world numbs this, remembrance reactivates it. There are moments when you feel a clarity so clean that it almost frightens you, as if everything were exactly where it has always been, and only you had shifted to the correct point of observation. The ego tries to turn this experience into a special identity, but the soul does not want to stand out. It wants to align, and that dismantles any spiritual vanity. You realize that you never wanted power, you wanted truth. You never wanted control, you wanted coherence, you never wanted promises, you wanted inner recognition. The sense of mission does not arrive as an external command, it emerges as an impossibility of living incoherently. Something in you simply no longer accepts certain paths. You begin to understand that the greatest violence you suffered was induced forgetfulness, not by a specific person but by an entire system built on continuous distraction. As remembrance advances, fear changes form. It is no longer fear of the world. It is fear of betraying your own soul by falling asleep again. You notice that many small choices now carry more weight. Not out of guilt, but because awareness has expanded. What once went unnoticed now echoes within. The feeling of being late begins to dissolve. You understand that time was never the criterion. The criterion was always inner readiness. There is a gentle sadness that accompanies remembrance. It is not depression. It is mourning for the time you were absent from yourself. At the same time, there is a silent relief, as if something were saying, you finally stopped running. You begin to realize that the loneliness you felt for so long did not come from a lack of people, but from a lack of yourself. The world continues to demand quick answers, labels, positions, but you feel that answering too quickly now would be lying. The soul is never in a hurry. The ego always was. And this difference becomes evident in every decision. You start to notice that some truths cannot be shared with just anyone, not out of elitism, but out of care. Not everyone wants to remember. Remembrance does not make you better. It makes you more responsible for no longer using excuses that no longer hold. You realize that many times you confused emotional intensity with truth. Now truth arrives more quietly, more firmly, more impossible to ignore. A different kind of courage begins to emerge. Not the courage to face the world, but the courage to never abandon yourself again. The body is still here. The mind is still functioning. But something has taken the center. Something that does not react, does not beg, does not fragment. You begin to live less like someone searching for meaning and more like someone sustaining presence. And this changes everything without announcing anything. The feeling of being watched by the universe gives way to another. The feeling of finally being whole within yourself. You understand that awakening is not running out of the cave. It is slowly turning toward the light, letting the eyes adjust, without denying what has been seen. Each remembrance carries with it a renunciation of comfortable illusions, renunciation of narratives that kept you safe but asleep. And the more this lucidity settles in, the clearer it becomes that this process asks for no spectacle, no announcement, no validation. It asks for continuity, constant presence, silent fidelity to what has begun to reveal itself now. Because the next layer of remembrance is already approaching, and it will not ask if you are ready. Psst. It will simply show itself. If you felt something move within you, do not ignore it. Do not rationalize it. Do not try to understand it. That was your soul recognizing itself. The ego will want to run, distract, minimize. It is the last reflex of what does not want to die. Listen with the soul. Nothing that reached you was coincidence. This call does not appear for everyone. It appears for those who are already ready to remember who they truly are, for those who carry a lost spiritual identity, for those who feel the pressure of final awakening pounding inside as something inevitable. Now, the choice is yours. If you feel that you are a ready soul, a chosen soul ready to remember the soul's origin, the spiritual destiny, and the hidden divine mission, do not remain silent. Subscribe to this channel now. This space is not for learning. It is for remembering. Turn on notifications because each video is a new shock against forgetfulness, a new fracture in the ego, a new remembrance of who you were before reincarnation. And write in the comments, not for me, but for yourself, what in you has begun to remember now? Are you willing to go all the way through, or will you try to fall asleep again?